To just sign it and get out of here. You don't belong in this house." Those were the words my beloved son said as my wife placed the divorce papers on the table. They had planned this in advance and took away everything I had built over 43 years. The only thing I had left was a ragged bag, $47 in cash, and the key to the remote old beach house that my father had left me. But what they truly did not know were the secrets inside that house, secrets that would make them regret. Before we begin, I'm genuinely grateful you're here. Thousands of people could be anywhere right now, and you chose this story. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country. I read every single one. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is worth your time. I have signed many documents in my life: tax returns, mortgage papers, a retirement notice that felt more like a question than an answer. But I had never signed anything without reading it first. Not once in 48 years of careful living. Until that Monday morning in March when 4 decades of trust made a fool of me in under an hour. The living room looked as it always had. Same beige walls, same oak floor with the long scratch near the bookshelf that Derek made when he was 11 and sliding in socked feet. Same painting of the Maine coastline above the fireplace, the one Linda had chosen, because it reminded her of somewhere she had always meant to go. I had always planned to take her there. I had always planned a great many things. Howard Greer arrived at 9 exactly. I had never met the man before that morning. Derek had introduced him 6 months prior as a family attorney who handles these kinds of matters. I had not asked for references. I had not arranged independent counsel of my own. The previous 6 months had stripped away many of my usual habits, including, it turned out, the habit of due diligence that had kept me employed for 34 years. Derek had quietly managed our joint finances since my retirement, and somewhere in that arrangement, my access to liquid funds had narrowed to nothing. Not enough to retain a lawyer. Just enough to miss it. Greer opened his briefcase and removed 2 separate document stacks. He set them in front of Linda first. She looked at them for a moment, then without meeting my eyes, slid the first stack across the table toward me with both hands. The gesture was quiet and deliberate, the kind that takes practice. Linda sat across from me, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed at a point just past my left shoulder. 43 years of mornings, and she would not look at me on this one. I told myself it was the grief of it. That was the easier thing to believe. Derek stood near the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone. He glanced at the screen twice in the first 2 minutes. "Dad," he said, not fully looking up. "Howard's ready whenever you are." Greer gestured toward the stack Linda had placed in front of me. "Settlement agreement, Mr. Calloway. Court reviewed and approved. The house and contents to Linda. $47,000 to you in a cash settlement. Everything is exactly as discussed." "I'd like to read through it first," I said. "Of course." Greer folded his hands. Derek exhaled through his nose quietly, but in the particular way that communicated impatience without technically being rude. "You've seen the summary 3 times, Dad. It's the same document." "Reading a document and reading a summary of it are not the same thing." He said nothing more. I read the first 5 pages. Dense language, but the terms matched what I had been told. The house, the cash, a clean division. I signed where Greer indicated. Linda signed hers without lifting her eyes from the page. Then Greer produced a second document. "This is a disbursement authorization," he said, sliding it across to me. "A private agreement separate from the court settlement. It authorizes Derek to manage the transfer of your funds and settle any remaining joint financial obligations on your behalf. Utility accounts, outstanding balances, administrative closures. so you don't have to navigate bank paperwork while everything else is still in transition. I looked at the document. 12 pages. Subclauses in smaller print beneath larger subclauses. I was 68 years old and had not slept properly in 3 weeks. The man sitting beside this lawyer was my son. He had called me every Sunday morning for 15 years. "Is this standard?" I asked. "Completely standard," Greer said. "Cool, it's just paperwork, Dad." Derek's voice dropped to something resembling patience. "It means I handle the logistics so you don't have to think about it. You'll have your money by Friday." I signed it. What I did not know, what I could not have known without understanding the specific language buried in the subclauses on page 8, was that the disbursement authorization gave Derek the legal authority to deduct any sum he categorized as an outstanding joint financial obligation from my $47,000 before transferring what remained. The document had been written to permit exactly that. It had been drafted that way deliberately. I would not fully understand what I had signed until I was standing at an ATM 4 hours later watching a screen read 0. Greer collected both sets of documents, tapped the edges against the table once to align them, and slid everything into his briefcase. It was in that moment, as the second stack of papers disappeared into the leather case, that I noticed Vanessa. She had been standing at the kitchen doorway throughout. Not invited in, not asked to leave. I had registered her the way you register a lamp present unremarkable. But as Greer's briefcase clicked shut, she turned slightly away from the room. It was not relief. It was not indifference. It was the expression of someone who has watched something happen that they could not stop and had hoped would not. And almost simultaneously, Greer glanced sideways at Derek. A single look, less than a second, the kind exchanged between people who have already agreed on something and are simply confirming it concluded as planned. I noted both things. I did not yet know what to do with either of them. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," Greer said, extending his hand. It was the first time anyone in that room had used my last name all morning. It landed the way a formality lands when it has already become accurate, as though I had quietly stopped being anyone's husband or father and had simply become a party to a completed transaction. He was gone in under 4 minutes. Derek glanced at his phone. "Car comes at 3. There's a bag upstairs, someone took care of it. I didn't ask anyone to pack for me. We thought it would be easier." I looked at the painting above the fireplace. The Maine coastline. Pale gray water, the long, uneven northern shore. Linda had chosen it because it reminded her of somewhere she had always wanted to go. I had always meant to take her. Some things become impossible before you understand they were ever in danger of becoming so. The clock marked another second. 3 hours. I had not thought past this table, this room, this morning. I had no plan for what came after the ink dried. 3 hours to fit 68 years into one bag. I discovered that most of what I thought I owned, I had only been holding for someone else. The duffel sat open on the bed, navy canvas, the kind sold at airport shops, not the kind a man chooses for himself. Someone had packed it with the efficient neutrality of a person completing a task rather than handling a life. 2 pairs of trousers, a week's worth of shirts folded with military precision, a toiletry bag I did not recognize. My reading glasses were not inside. Neither was the photograph of my father that had lived on the nightstand for 11 years. I checked the wardrobe. The photograph was gone. The old watch my father had worn for 30 years, the one with the scratched crystal and the weight that always surprised you when you first picked it up, was gone too. I stood at the open wardrobe for a moment and decided not to ask about it. Some questions confirm things you are not yet ready to have confirmed. I worked through the room systematically, the way I had always approached problems, methodically, without sentiment getting ahead of the facts. I added the photograph from my wallet, a second pair of shoes, the small notebook I kept in the bedside drawer. I zipped the duffel and lifted it. Light. Remarkably, insultingly light. My winter coat was hanging behind the bedroom door, overlooked by whoever had done the packing. I put it on. As I reached for the collar, my fingers found something in the right pocket. A key ring, 2 keys, a small leather tag, worn soft with age. Stamped into the leather in faded capital letters, H.C. Shore Road. Harrow Cove, Shore Road, my father's beach house. I had not held these keys in 7 years, not since the summer before Arthur's health began its long decline. I stood there with the key ring in my palm and thought about a kitchen that smelled of cedar and salt, a porch that faced the water, a man who stood at the shoreline with his sleeves rolled to the elbow even in October. I had not thought about Harrow Cove in a very long time. I was not certain why I still had these keys. I was not certain of much that morning. I put them back in my pocket and carried the duffel downstairs. Derek was waiting near the front door jacket on phone in hand. He held out a small envelope, white letter-sized, unsealed. "The disbursement handled the joint obligations," he said. "There's some cash in there, enough to get you started." I took the envelope without opening it. "The 47,000 goes through by Friday, you said." "That's right." "And the disbursement handled what exactly?" Derek met my eyes for the first time since the morning. "Outstanding balances. Utilities going back 2 years, the home maintenance account, some of the legal costs. Howard itemized everything." He said it the way a man says something he has practiced. Smooth, unbroken. "It's all documented." I looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable for either of us. "Take care of yourself, Dad," he said. I walked out. The neighborhood was quiet, in the way residential streets go quiet on a Monday afternoon. Everyone somewhere they are supposed to be moving through the architecture of ordinary lives. I carried the duffel 3 blocks to the bank branch on Millfield Avenue. The ATM stood outside under an overhang. I inserted my card, checked the joint account balance. The screen read, "Available balance $0." I stood there long enough that a woman behind me cleared her throat softly. I stepped aside. I opened the envelope Derek had given me. Inside was cash bills of various denominations folded once. I counted them against the wall of the bank. $47. 4 tens, 1521s. I was a bookkeeper for 34 years. The arithmetic took me less than 5 seconds. The disbursement authorization I had signed that morning had authorized Derek to deduct any amount he classified as an outstanding joint obligation before transferring my share of the settlement. What had been recorded as legitimate debts, utility arrears, maintenance fees, accumulated legal costs had been categorized, documented, and deducted. $46,953 of fabricated or grossly inflated obligations processed and removed before the funds ever reached my name. What remained? $47. Handed to me in an envelope at my own front door. The fraud was civil, not criminal, and nearly impossible to prove without documentation that existed somewhere in Howard Greer's files and in whatever Derek had arranged. I had signed the instrument that made it legal on paper. I had signed it voluntarily. I had signed it because my son had told me it was standard. I put the cash in my coat pocket alongside the key ring. It was then that a particular memory surfaced, the kind that arrives without warning and carries more weight than it should. 2 years ago, Derek had asked me in passing whether I still held the deed to the old shore property, the beach house Arthur had left, the one I had not visited in years. I had said yes. Derek had nodded and changed the subject within the same breath. I had thought nothing of it then. Standing outside a bank with $47 and a canvas duffel, I thought quite a bit about it now. I walked to the bus station on Commerce Street. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Where to?" she said. "Harrow Cove. Fastest connection you have." She checked the screen. Last connection arrives past midnight. 2 transfers, Linden Junction and Port Carver. Leaves here at 7:15. How much? $22.50. I counted out the bills. $22.50. I would have exactly $24.50 remaining after the transaction. The clerk printed the ticket and slid it across the counter. I picked it up and looked at it for a moment. The name of the destination printed in plain black type, as ordinary as any other word. I thought about whether the house would be livable after 7 years empty. I thought about whether the key would still turn in the lock. I thought about $24.50 and a navy canvas duffel and a scratch on an oak floor that no longer had my name on it. I stopped thinking about most of that and bought the ticket. The last bus east left at 7:15. I had asked 3 times to be certain, the way a man asks when he is afraid the answer might change on him. The station was the kind of place that exists between other places: fluorescent light, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a vending machine with a broken coin slot someone had taped a handwritten note to. I sat in the second row from the back, the duffel between my feet, and waited. Around me, other passengers arranged themselves with the resigned comfort of people accustomed to this particular kind of waiting. A woman with a sleeping child across her lap, a college-aged man with headphones and a backpack the size of a small refrigerator, an older couple who had brought their own sandwiches and ate them in companionable silence. Nobody looked at me. That was fine. I did not particularly want to be looked at. The driver boarded at 7:10, a heavy-set man in a gray jacket who moved through his pre-departure checklist with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to trust shortcuts. "Linden Junction," I asked as I boarded. "Last stop," he said without looking up from his clipboard. "Hour 45. Transfer boards at the north platform." "Thank you." He tore the stub from my ticket and moved on. I found my row and sat down. My phone had 4% battery when I plugged it into the seat charger. 3 missed calls from a number I did not recognize. 1 voicemail from Derek I played. The first 8 seconds heard his voice begin with the word "just" in the particular way that meant he was managing something, and deleted it. I did not feel strongly about this decision either way. I simply could not use the energy. The bus moved through Crestwood's outskirts in the last of the evening light subdivisions, giving way to strip malls, giving way to gas stations and open fields, giving way to darkness and the occasional overpass light. I watched it go without trying to hold on to any of it. At Linden Junction, I transferred to a connecting coach. The platform was cold and mostly empty. A young woman in a hospital uniform was eating a granola bar with the focused intensity of someone who had not had time for a proper meal. "Port Carver connection?" I asked. "Other side of the platform," she said. "Leaves in 12 minutes. You'll want to move." I moved. The second bus was older, the seats a degree less comfortable, the windows faintly fogged at the edges. I was the only person who boarded at Linden Junction heading east. The driver did not acknowledge me beyond a nod. That was enough. It was on this second bus, somewhere in the dark stretch between Linden Junction and Port Carver, that I took out my phone and typed 2 words into the search bar: Arthur Calloway. I was not sure what I expected. My father had been a private man, resistant to documentation of any kind, suspicious of people who wanted to put things in writing. He had kept no social media, given no interviews that I was aware of, maintained no public presence beyond the business he ran and the community he fed for 40 years. The third result was a link to a local newspaper archive. A 2007 article. The headline read, "The Best Chowder on the New England Coast, Arthur Calloway's Shore Kitchen." I read it twice. The article described a man I recognized, and one I had somehow failed to fully see. It described the kitchen at Harrow Cove on a Tuesday morning, the cast iron pots, the particular method Arthur used for the chowder base, the way he insisted on sourcing his clams from the same 3 fishermen he had worked with for decades. It described the regular customers who drove 40 minutes each way for a bowl of something that, in the journalist's words, tasted less like a recipe and more like a decision about how to live. It quoted Arthur once near the end. "Food is just time made visible. If you rush it, people can tell. They may not know why, but they can tell." I had heard my father say variations of that sentence my entire childhood. I had never thought to write it down. I had never thought it was the kind of thing that needed writing. I had forgotten a great many things. The overnight train out of Port Carver was quieter than the buses, the particular quiet of a vehicle moving fast through dark landscape, the kind of silence that accumulates rather than simply exists. I found a window seat in an almost empty car. The seat beside me stayed empty. An older man in the row across the aisle looked over after we had been moving for 20 minutes. He had the comfortable, unhurried demeanor of someone who has made this trip before. "Heading far?" he asked. "Harrow Cove," I said. "End of the line." He nodded with mild recognition. "You have people there." My father did. He looked at me for a moment, not with pity exactly, more, with the acknowledgement of a man who understood that some sentences carry more than their words, and then looked back out the window. I did what he did, looked out the window. I made myself inventory what I actually had. 1 canvas duffel, $24.50. 1 key ring with a leather tag. 1 address on a shore road I had not visited in 7 years. 1 photograph of my father taken at Harrow Cove the summer before his health turned. He was standing at the water's edge, squinting into the light, wearing an expression that suggested he was calculating something private and pleasant. I had carried this photograph in my wallet for 11 years, without once thinking about where it was taken. I had not made a plan beyond the end of this train line. For the first time in roughly 4 decades, that was not a problem I was solving. It was simply a fact I was inhabiting. I was not sure there was a meaningful difference between those 2 things, but it felt like there might be. And that was enough to hold on to for the moment. The train arrived at Harrow Cove Station at 1:40 in the morning. The doors opened with a sound like a long exhale. Cold salt air moved into the car, a particular kind of cold, dense and tidal, the kind that settles into your coat rather than passing through it. I stepped onto the platform and stood still for a moment with my eyes closed. I breathed. The station attendant was folding a newspaper behind the ticket window. "Taxi stand?" I asked. He looked up. "Last cab left at 11, nothing until 6. "How far to the old Shore Road, northern end?" He considered this. "Walking 40 minutes maybe. Head straight through town, follow the coast markers past the cannery." "Thank you." I picked up the duffel, settled the strap on my shoulder, and walked out of the station into the dark. $24.50. A canvas bag. A keyring. Nothing beyond the end of this road, which was, I thought, precisely $24.50 more than I had expected to have by morning. 2 miles on an unlit coastal road in March teaches a 68-year-old man things about himself. None of them are comfortable. All of them are true. The road ran along the edge of the coast, rather than the water itself, separated from the beach by a low ridge of seagrass and wind-shaped scrub pine. I could hear the ocean before I could see it, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed less like noise and more like the place reminding itself it was still there. My shoes were not built for this kind of walking. My back, which had been difficult since the surgery 4 years ago, registered its opinion somewhere around the 1st mile and continued to register it thereafter. I did not stop. The shore road narrowed past the old cannery. The station attendant had mentioned the building dark, and salt bleached its windows, opaque with decades of coastal weather. Beyond it, the road curved northeast, and the tree line thinned. The stars were sharper here than they had any right to be. I had forgotten how dark the dark gets when it is not interrupted. The house appeared at the bend. I recognized it the way you recognize something that has lived in the back of your mind for years, without being examined immediately, and with the slight disorientation of finding the real thing smaller than the memory. It sat at the top of a short rise above the beach, a single-story structure of weathered clapboard with a porch that faced the water. One shutter had come loose on the left side and hung at a slight angle. The porch railing had darkened with age, but the roof was intact, the foundation solid, the whole structure carrying the particular dignity of something that has endured a long time without making a fuss about it. I stood on the road for a moment and looked at it. Then I walked up the rise and put the key in the lock. It was stiff 3 full seconds of resistance before it turned the mechanism, complaining about the cold and the years in equal measure. The door opened inward with a sound that was less a creak and more a long exhale. The smell of the house reached me before anything else. Cedar salt, the particular dryness of enclosed space that has been carefully sealed against the outside. Not the smell of abandonment, the smell of waiting. Inside, the furniture was covered with canvas dropcloths, pale shapes arranged in the dark, like objects in a dream. The kitchen shelving was clear and wiped. A cord of firewood was stacked neatly beside the hearth, not weathered wood, left from years ago, but seasoned timber recently split the cut ends, still light in color. Someone had been here, not long ago. I did not question it then. I pulled the dropcloth from the armchair beside the front window, Arthur's chair, the one he had always sat in, because it faced the water, and sat down in it. The window faced east. I watched it. I was still watching it when the light began to change. There is a particular quality to the first light on the coast in early March. Not warm exactly, more a kind of pale luminosity that arrives ahead of the sun itself, turning the water from black to gray to something with color in it. I watched it move. I did not sleep. I was not sure I could have slept if I had tried. The knock came shortly after full sunrise. I opened the door to find a man of roughly 70, broad-shouldered and weathered in the way of someone who has spent most of his life working outdoors, holding 2 mugs of coffee with the natural ease of someone who had fully expected to find the door answered. He wore a canvas jacket and rubber-soled boots. He was looking at me with an expression that I could not immediately categorize. "Saw the light on," he said. "Nobody's been in that house in 3 years." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry if I startled you." "You didn't." He extended one of the mugs. "I'm Eddie Marsh. Live in the cottage about 100 yards north. Have for 30 years. I took the mug. James Calloway. Arthur was my father. Something moved across Eddie's face when I said that. Not surprise, it was not the expression of a man receiving unexpected information. It was closer to recognition, the particular look of someone who has been waiting for a thing to happen, and is watching it happen now. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You'd better come in out of the cold and tell me what brings you here." We sat at Arthur's kitchen table with the coffee. Eddie explained without being asked about the firewood and the cleared shelves and the state of the house. The trust documents that Arthur had filed with Thomas Whitfield included a maintenance clause, a small annual fee paid to Eddie in exchange for keeping the property in habitable condition, checking the roof seals twice a year, splitting firewood each autumn, clearing the shelves of anything perishable, keeping the plumbing from freezing in winter. "Your father wrote it in himself," Eddie said. "Specific language. He told me the house should be ready when it's needed, Eddie. I don't know when that will be, but it should be ready." He wrapped both hands around his mug. I never asked what he meant by that. I figured I'd know when I saw it. "And now?" I asked. Now I think I was right to wait. I looked at the window and the gray water beyond it. "He never told me about any of this." "No," Eddie said simply. "He wouldn't have. There was nothing defensive or evasive in the way he said it. It was stated the way you state something that simply is a fact with weight, but no particular edge. I understood without being told more that there was something else Eddie knew and was not yet saying. The understanding arrived the way some understandings do, not as a conclusion, but as a shape, something I could see the outline of without yet seeing the center. "Your father spoke about you often," Eddie said. Then he stopped. He lifted his mug and drank. I waited. He did not continue. When he stood to leave, I walked with him to his door. At the threshold, he paused, not long, perhaps 3 seconds, and looked back at the beach house over his shoulder. His expression in that moment was not one I had a ready word for. It was not grief, and it was not quite relief, and it was something more specific than either. The look of a man who has been holding a thing in trust for a long time and has watched it arrive at the person it was meant for. He went inside without explanation. I stood in the early morning cold and filed that look away alongside the others, Vanessa turning away from the room, Greer's sideways glance at Derek, and walked back to the house that had apparently been waiting for me longer than I knew. After the coffee and the careful conversation that answered nothing directly, I went back to the house alone and began room by room to understand what my father had left behind. I moved through it methodically, the way I had always moved through problems, accounting for what was present before forming any view of what it meant. The front room held the covered furniture and a small bookshelf with a collection of regional guides and fishing almanacs going back to the 1980s. The second bedroom had been used as storage at some point, and now held only a folded cot and 2 empty wooden crates. The bathroom was clean, the pipes functional, the mirror slightly foxed at its lower edge from years of salt air. The main bedroom was the last room on the right. Arthur's wardrobe stood against the far wall, tall, dark-stained pine, the wood dry but solid. I opened the upper section, first wire hangers, a folded wool blanket on the shelf above them, a box of spare matches. Then the middle section, a pair of boots that had been carefully cleaned and left with newspaper inside them to hold their shape. Then the bottom section, the lowest shelf, and there it was, a tin box. Blue, the kind once used for tea or shortbread, roughly the size of a shoebox. On its lid, a strip of masking tape with words written in my father's unmistakable hand, the particular slant of a man who had learned to write before anyone cared about penmanship for James. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held it for a moment before opening it. Inside, arranged in careful order, 23 cloth-covered notebooks, each one bound with a thin strip of leather stacked in 2 rows. Beneath them, resting flat against the tin's bottom, a sealed envelope, cream-colored, a little worn at the corners. My name on the front in the same handwriting as the label, "James, open when you're ready." And taped to the inside of the lid, separated from everything else, a smaller envelope no larger than an index card. Inside it, a business card, Thomas Whitfield Estate and Property Law, Harrow County, and a slip of paper in Arthur's hand. He handled the paperwork for this house. If you ever need help with it, call him. I read the slip twice, then took out my phone and dialed the number on the card. The automated recording was immediate. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." I set the business card on the nightstand. An old number likely changed when Whitfield moved offices or changed practice. I would search for an updated listing later. I put it in my coat pocket and turned back to the box. I brought everything to the kitchen table and laid it out, the notebooks in their stacked rows, the sealed envelope to one side, the tin itself pushed toward the wall. Then I opened the top drawer of the kitchen cabinet looking for something to write with. I found instead a plain white envelope tucked beneath a slotted spoon, the kind of envelope you might put a birthday card in. Inside, a folded collection of bills in various denominations, the total adding to $340. On the fold of the envelope, Arthur's handwriting again, 4 words. "For whoever needs it first." I stood at the kitchen counter with $340 in my hand and understood that my father had thought of this, had thought of the specific fact of someone arriving here with not quite enough, had thought ahead to the practical reality of it, beyond sentiment, beyond ceremony. He had left what a person would need to begin. I put the money in my coat pocket with the business card. I sat down at the table and opened the first notebook. The pages were dense with Arthur's handwriting, not the cramped script of a man trying to fit too much in, but the deliberate hand of someone who had thought carefully about what to set down and how. The first entry was a recipe for clam chowder, but it was not only that. Alongside the measurements and the sequence of steps, there were marginal notes in smaller script observations about heat and timing questions. He had asked himself one line near the bottom that read, "A recipe is a record of decisions. Make them like they matter." I was still reading when Eddie knocked at the kitchen door. He came in without waiting. The way a man comes into a space he has looked after for years and set a plate of buttered toast on the table beside the notebooks without comment. He looked at the stacked notebooks. He looked at the tin. Then he saw the sealed envelope still resting apart from the others. He went still, not dramatically, no sharp intake of breath, no visible change of color. He simply became more still than he had already been, the way a man becomes still when he sees something he was told to expect, but had not expected to see so soon. "Did he say anything to you about that?" I asked, nodding at the envelope. "Some." Eddie pulled out the other kitchen chair and sat down heavily. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing words rather than simply reaching for them. "He said you'd find it when you needed it. Said you'd know what the notebooks were for once you'd spent some time with them. He told you I'd come here. He said someone would. He was specific about the notebooks, said they'd make more sense than they look." Eddie looked at the first one still open to the chowder recipe. He wasn't wrong about much. "Did he say when to open the letter?" Eddie looked at the sealed envelope again. Something moved through his expression. Not evasion, but the careful management of a man who has been given a piece of information to hold and is thinking precisely about where the line is. "He said you'd know when you were ready," Eddie said finally. His exact words. I picked up the envelope, turned it over in my hands. The flap was sealed with wax, a small, unadorned disc of dark red wax that Arthur had pressed flat with his thumb. I could see the swirl of his thumbprint in it. I wanted to open it. Something in the way Eddie had gone still made me set it down instead. I slid it back into the tin box and closed the lid. Not yet. I did not know yet what I needed to become before I opened it. I only knew it wasn't this, not a man who had been in this house for 8 hours with $24.50 and a canvas bag, and not one clear thought passed tomorrow morning. The toast had gone slightly cold. I ate it anyway. By the second morning, I had read through 4 notebooks. By the 5th morning, I understood that my father had not written recipes. He had written a record of how to live carefully and without waste. The notebooks were numbered in sequence on their inside covers, the numbers written in the same slanted hand as everything else. Arthur had maintained them over what appeared to be several decades, the earliest entries in ink that had faded to brown at the edges, the later ones in blue ballpoint, the handwriting consistent throughout, but with the slight loosening that comes to a person's writing as they age and stop being self-conscious about it. I read them in order, one a day in the mornings, going back to passages in the afternoons. On the 3rd day, Eddie appeared at the kitchen door with a thermos of coffee and the unself-conscious ease of a man who has stopped needing to be invited in. "Read me something," he said, pulling out the second chair. I looked up from the notebook I was holding. Out loud. He wrote it to be read. Might as well let it move through the air a little. I read him the clam chowder entry from Notebook 1. Then the recipe for Finn and Hattie that occupied 3 pages of Notebook 4, with its marginal argument with itself about the right proportion of smoked fish to cream. Eddie listened the way a person listens to music they haven't heard in a long time, attending to it without commenting on it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Chidum, he used to say that one out loud, Eddie said. The cream proportion thing. Like it was an ongoing disagreement he hadn't settled. Had he settled it? No. He changed his mind about it every third batch until the day he couldn't cook anymore. He refilled his cup from the thermos. That's how you know a man takes something seriously. He never stops arguing with it. I turned to a page I had marked the night before Notebook 6, midway through a passage that had given me pause when I first read it. I did not read it aloud then. I had gone back to it twice in the dark and sat with it. The entry read, "Some people are made small by what they want. You cannot fix that for them. You can only make sure it does not make you small too." There was no name anywhere in the entry. No indication of who or when or what had prompted it. It could have been general. It could have been professional. But I had read too many of these notebooks by then to mistake Arthur's habits he wrote around specifics, when the specifics were people he loved or people connected to people he loved. He had always been that way. He considered it a form of respect. I closed Notebook 6 and set it down on the table. He wrote one that sounds like something he would have said to me. I told Eddie. Not because I needed to explain it, but because I had been holding it alone for 2 days. Eddie did not ask which one. He just nodded in the way of a man who has thought this too and considered it already settled. On the 6th morning, I sat on Eddie's porch while he mended a section of fishing net, a task he approached with the methodical patience of long practice, and read aloud from Notebook 3. The passage was one I had returned to several times. A man who learns to feed people will never be truly without a place in the world. Eddie set down the net. He said that to me, he said. Out loud. Sitting about where you're sitting now maybe 12 years ago. I told him I thought it was a fine sentiment, but that it didn't pay the bills. He picked the net back up. He said that wasn't what he meant. What did he mean? He never explained. That was your father, he said things, and waited for you to arrive at them yourself. He examined a knot in the net. I've thought about it many times since. I think I've arrived at it now. What did you arrive at? Eddie was quiet for a moment. That feeding people is how some men stay present in the world. Not just alive, present. Like they belong somewhere specific. He looped the mending cord through the mesh. Your father was like that. He needed the kitchen the way some men need the water. That evening, I searched Thomas Whitfield's name on my phone. The number from the business card had not connected, but I had been meaning to look for an updated listing since finding the card 2 days after I arrived. A law firm 2 hours north on the Harrow County Register of Attorneys Whitfield and Associates Estate Trust and Property Law. The same name, different address and number. I dialed. A receptionist answered on the second ring. Her voice had the measured warmth of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. I'm trying to reach Thomas Whitfield, I said. My name is James Calloway. My father was Arthur Calloway. Mr. Whitfield handled some paperwork for him. I have a business card from the original filing. A brief pause. I'm sorry, Mr. Calloway. Mr. Whitfield is currently on medical leave. We expect him back in approximately 3 months. May I take your number and have someone follow up? Please, I said and gave her my number. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. 3 months. Whatever Thomas Whitfield knew about the trust about the house, about any of what my father had arranged, it would keep. The house was standing. The notebooks were here. The sealed letter was in the tin box, on the shelf, the wax thumbprint still intact. I opened Notebook 7 and read until the light outside changed. That night, I set the tin box on the table and looked at the three things I was not yet ready for. The sealed letter, the business card, the number I had now dialed twice into dead air. Three objects each representing something my father had thought to leave, each requiring something from me that I had not yet found the capacity to give. I closed the box. I would be ready, I thought. I needed only a little more time. I did not yet understand that time was something Arthur had already arranged for me, had arranged with the same quiet, specific forethought he had applied to everything else. I would not understand that for another several months. But the process of understanding had already begun in the particular way that understanding begins long before you are aware of it. Cooking from scratch at 68 in a kitchen built for a far better man than me turned out to require a patience I was not entirely certain I still possessed. I had not cooked in any serious sense for the length of my marriage. Linda had managed the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who considered it a domain, and I had managed the books with the efficiency of someone who considered it his. And for 43 years, this arrangement had worked in the way that most practical arrangements work, silently, and without either party stopping to examine it. Now I stood alone in front of Arthur's cast iron pot with Notebook 1 open on the counter, and I understood for the first time that I did not know what to do with my hands. Eddie arrived at the end of March with a manila folder and a look that suggested he had been waiting to have this particular conversation. "There's something in the trust documents you should know about," he said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. "A clause your father wrote in specifically. It authorizes monthly payments from the trust account up to $500 to cover basic living expenses for the property's beneficiary while the property is occupied." I looked at the folder. He wrote that in himself, his exact language. He told Thomas Whitfield, "Anyone who comes home will arrive with nothing. Make sure the house can carry them for a while." Eddie slid the folder across. "First disbursement process is end of March. It's not a fortune." "It's enough," I said. It was. $500 a month, combined with the $340 Arthur had left in the kitchen drawer, gave me a working margin I had not expected to have. I used it carefully, the way a person uses money when they understand it is finite, and the situation that produced it will not be repeated. Eddie contributed in his own way, which was to say, without framing it as contribution at all. He appeared at the back door 2 or 3 mornings a week with fresh clams in a bucket or a length of cod wrapped in paper, the way a man brings the surplus of his work, without making a ceremony of the giving. "Caught more than I need," he would say, which may or may not have been true, and I did not press the point. The first week I attempted Arthur's clam chowder. The result was edible in the way that things are edible when you are hungry enough. Too much clam, the ratio skewed by my decision to use what was in the pantry, rather than waiting for the fresh delivery Eddie had promised. The flavor was present but wrong, more like the idea of chowder than the thing itself. Eddie tasted it standing at the counter the way he tasted everything without sitting down or making a production of it. "Candy," he said. "There weren't enough fresh ones." "A notebook says fresh. That's not a preference, it's a load-bearing instruction." I made a note in the margin of Notebook 1. The following week, Eddie brought clams. The second attempt was structurally better and texturally worse. I had corrected the protein ratio, but rushed the base, adding the cream before the chowder had developed enough of its own character to hold it. The cream broke in the heat, leaving the soup with a slightly curdled surface that was unpleasant to look at and difficult to ignore once noticed. Eddie ate a full bowl without comment. "You ate all of it," I said. "I was hungry." "But it wasn't right." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. But eating it is how you learn what right feels like." By the third week, I had the base correct and the cream correctly timed, but the seasoning was off in a way I could not diagnose from the recipe alone, a flatness that sat at the back of the flavor, the culinary equivalent of a sentence that means what it says, but nothing more. "Getting closer," Eddie said, setting down his spoon. "You said that last week. Last week I was being kind. This week I mean it." "What's wrong with it?" He considered the bowl. "Not enough time before you season it. You're adding salt before the chowder knows what it is yet. Wait until it settles." I wrote that down too. The notebook's margins were filling with my own handwriting, alongside Arthur's, a conversation across years that neither of us had known we were having. I was also in the hours between cooking attempts, repairing the house. The porch board on the left side of the entrance had developed a soft spot that shifted underfoot in a way I found concerning. I replaced it over the course of a long afternoon with lumber from a stack behind the back wall that Eddie had left there at some point in the past 2 years. The kitchen window's seal had deteriorated enough to let in a thread of cold air along the lower sash. I reglazed it with compound I found in the utility closet. The shelf above the kitchen counter had developed a sag at its midpoint from decades of weight. I shimmed it level with a wedge cut from the leftover porch board. These were not complicated repairs. They were the kind of work that requires attention rather than skill, slow, repeated, corrected when wrong, and corrected again until it held. It was the same discipline as the cooking. I began to understand that Arthur had known this, had chosen to leave both things together in the same house for a reason. The 4th week, I followed Notebook 1 without deviation. I sourced the clams Eddie brought the morning of, broke them down at the proper temperature, built the base over low heat without rushing it, and waited, genuinely waited. The way the notebook described waiting until the chowder had developed its own internal logic before I touched the seasoning. When I added the cream, Eddie said now, and I added it then, not a moment before. Eddie lifted the spoon, tasted, and set the bowl down on the counter. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the water. "That's Arthur's recipe," he said. "Not good. Not much better." That is Arthur's recipe, spoken with the simple accuracy of a man identifying something he had known well and had been waiting a long time to taste again. Outside, the tide was moving and the sound of it steady and unhurried against the shingle. I stood at the stove and held something I had no name for, yet not pride exactly, and not relief, and not the particular grief of missing someone. Something that belonged to none of those categories, and possibly to all of them at once. That evening, I turned to the last empty page at the back of Notebook 1. I had not written anything at all since leaving Crestwood. I picked up the pen and wrote the date. Below it, 3 words, week 4. It worked. I sat looking at those 3 words for a long time. I thought about my father standing in this kitchen, at whatever age he had been when this started for him, holding whatever version of this feeling it was at the very beginning. I thought about whether it had felt to him the way it felt to me now. I suspected it had. I hoped so. By May, the house no longer looked like it was waiting to be torn down. It had begun to look like it was waiting for something, and I had begun to think I might know what that was. The weeks between April and May had been occupied with the kind of incremental progress that is easy to miss while it is happening, and easier to recognize from the other side. The chowder had become consistent, not every batch perfect, but none of them failures, which was more than I had expected when I started. I had worked through 8 of the notebooks, making notes in the margins, carrying questions to Eddie, whose patience for my interruptions seemed inexhaustible. The house itself had steadied under the repairs, the porch level, now the kitchen window sealed against the sea air, the shelf above the counter straight and silent under weight. On the 2nd morning of May, Eddie appeared at the back door with 2 sawhorses, a plank of lumber, and no explanation. "What's that for?" I asked. "Sandy," he said, "for the road. We built it together." Over the course of a long afternoon, two sawhorses set at the edge of the gravel turnout, where the shore road widened slightly. Before the bend, the plank laid across them a length of oilcloth tacked to the plank's surface for weather. The sign was a piece of plywood Eddie found behind his cottage, the lettering done in house paint, with a brush too large for the purpose: chowder, crab, fresh catch, priced on board. The result was legible rather than handsome, which Arthur's notebook would have approved of. The first morning I set up at 6 and waited. 3 vehicles passed without slowing before 8 o'clock. 2 pickup trucks and an SUV moving at the pace of people already late for something. I stood behind the plank and watched them go without taking it personally. The 4th car slowed, pulled onto the gravel, and a man in a contractor's jacket leaned out the window. "How much for the chowder?" he asked. $7 a cup, 12 for a quart. He bought a quart, paid in cash, said nothing further, and drove on. I watched the car disappear around the bend and noted the transaction in the back of Notebook 1 below the entry from 3 weeks ago. Rosa Delgado arrived at 9:30. She was still in her scrubs, pale blue, the kind issued by hospital systems rather than chosen, and she moved with the slightly compressed energy of a person at the far end of a long night shift who has not yet allowed herself to fully stop. She pulled onto the gravel in a small sedan and came to the stand with her hands in her pockets, looking at the handwritten price board with the alert, evaluating expression of someone accustomed to making quick assessments. "Is the chowder hot?" she asked. "Made it this morning. I'll take a cup." She took it and stepped back from the stand, leaning against the hood of her car with the cup held in both hands. She ate without speaking. Somewhere around the midpoint, she went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary silence, a stillness that suggested the food had her full attention, that she was tasting it rather than simply consuming it. She looked up. "Where did you learn to make this?" she asked. "My father's notebooks," I said. "He ran a kitchen here for about 40 years. What was his name?" "Arthur Calloway." Something moved through her expression. Not recognition exactly, more a kind of reaching back. The look of someone consulting a memory that is present, but not immediately accessible. "I've heard that name," she said slowly. "My mother used to drive up here on Sundays when I was small. I think she came for the chowder. A lot of people did." She finished the cup and held it in her hand a moment longer. "Is he still cooking? He passed 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." She said it without the reflexive quality that those words often carry. She meant it, or at least she recognized that it was a real thing she was responding to. "Can I get another one to take with me?" I filled a second cup and lidded it. She paid and turned toward her car, then turned back. "Will you be here next week?" "I plan to be." She nodded, as if this settled something she had been quietly deciding, and drove away. Later that week, Thomas Whitfield called. His voice was quieter than I had expected, the voice of a man still conserving energy, still somewhere in the process of returning to himself. He apologized for not returning my earlier message sooner and asked what I needed. I told him about the property, about arriving in March, about the trust. "Six, I know about the trust," he said. "I set it up. The Harrow Cove property is held in an irrevocable trust with you as the named beneficiary. It cannot be claimed as a marital asset, cannot be seized in a personal judgment, and cannot be transferred without your consent. It is fully protected." A brief pause. "If anyone ever challenges it, anyone at all, call me immediately." "I will," I said. "Thank you. I'll be back in the office in August. We should meet properly then." I agreed and set the phone down on the kitchen table. I sat with the information for a moment, the way you sit with something when you realize it is more solid than you had dared to assume. The house was protected. Whatever else was uncertain, and a good deal remained uncertain, the house was not part of it. That evening, as I was washing the last of the equipment from the day Eddie called in from the porch, where he had been sitting in the early dark. That woman who came back for seconds, he said. She had a look when she tasted it. A look. Same one your father used to get. First day he sold a bowl. He was quiet for a moment. I saw it every time he got it right. After a while I started watching for it. And Eddie stood and picked up his jacket from the chair. Today was the first time I've seen it on someone else. He said it simply, without weight or ceremony, and went inside. I stood at the plank counter in the evening light and wrote the day's earnings in the back of notebook 1. Below week 4, it worked. I added the date, the number of cups sold, and the total. Below that, without planning to, I wrote Rosa Delgado. Came back for a second cup. I closed the notebook. Looked at the tin box on the kitchen shelf. Thomas had confirmed the trust was protected. There was no legal threat tonight. No reason to open that box and reach for the things still waiting inside it. I had soup to make in the morning. I had learned slowly and imperfectly to stay inside the present day. For now, that was sufficient. Before I reveal what Eddie had been keeping from me all these months, I need to know you're still here. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. That's it. Just 9. It tells me you've stayed this far, and that means more than you might think. Quick note. This story contains fictional elements shaped for storytelling and reflection. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings, you can step away right here. But if you're staying, what comes next is worth it. June arrived with longer evenings and a particular quality of coastal quiet, the kind that accumulates rather than settles, that fills the space between things, and makes the postponed questions rise whether you invite them or not. The wooden stand had been running for 5 weeks. Rosa had returned 3 times, always on her way home from a night shift, always in the same scrubs, always purchasing a second cup without appearing to have consciously decided to. 2 other regular customers had established themselves, a contractor who stopped on Fridays and a retired couple who drove up from Millbrook on alternating Saturdays and sat on the tailgate of their truck to eat. The notebooks continued. The repairs on the house were for the moment complete. I had been watching Eddie for weeks. Not watching in any deliberate way, more in the way you notice the shape of something when you stop looking directly at it. The careful pauses before certain sentences. The way he answered some questions with a different question. The way he had gone still when he saw the sealed letter. A man who maintains a trust property for 15 years at the request of its owner and claims to know nothing of that owner's intentions is not a man I was prepared to continue believing. On the 3rd Thursday of June, I found Eddie on the old fishing pier at the far end of the cove, 100 yards past his cottage, where he went in the early evenings to fish for something he rarely seemed to catch. I walked out to the end of the pier and stood beside him. "What have you been holding back?" I said. He did not look surprised. He did not look caught. He set his rod against the railing, straightened up, and looked at the water for a moment before he looked at me. "Not all of it," he said, "or just the part that's hardest to say. Start wherever you need to." What Eddie told me that evening I have since thought about many times and in many different orders. I will try to give it in the order he gave it to me, which was not quite chronological but had its own internal logic. In 2008, Derek had borrowed $85,000 from me. I had told my father about it sometime that same year, told him the way you tell a parent something you have already decided not to act on yourself as a kind of release valve. According to Eddie, my father had listened without comment, and then within a week had called Thomas Whitfield. The result was the trust. Arthur had taken the beach house, which he still owned outright, at that point the property of his own working life, and placed it in an irrevocable trust, naming me as the sole beneficiary. The trust's title, the Arthur Callaway Irrevocable Trust. Under that structure, the property was owned by the trust, not by Arthur personally, and not by me. This meant it could not be counted as part of my marital estate. It could not be reached by any settlement, any judgment, any arrangement I might sign without understanding what I was signing. Arthur had told Eddie what he had done. He had asked Eddie to witness his intentions, if not the legal documents themselves, and he had given one instruction: don't tell James until he finds his own way back to the house. I asked him why he had waited 3 months after my arrival to tell me this. He set down his rod and looked at the water. Your father's instruction wasn't only about the house, he said. It was about timing. I wasn't going to hand you more than you could carry. He was specific about that, I asked. Those exact words, Eddie said. I asked him what he meant finds his own way back. He said, if I tell him, he'll hold on to it. He'll make decisions based on it. I need him to get there on his own. Eddie picked up his rod again without casting. I didn't fully understand it then. I think I understand it now. I stood at the railing and looked at the water. There was a particular weight to learning that something had been arranged for you by someone who could no longer be thanked. There's something else, Eddie said. He told me then about a phone call he had received 3 months earlier in March, the same week I had arrived at the house. A woman had called him on the number listed in an old address book she had found among some of Arthur's papers. Her name was Vanessa. Eddie described the conversation with the care of a man who understood that what he was relaying was not entirely his to give. Vanessa had been holding documents copies she had made over an extended period from papers she had found in Derek's home office. She was not certain who to contact. She had found Eddie's name and number and had called on a calculation that any person Arthur Calloway had trusted was likely a person worth trusting. What she told Eddie, the disbursement authorization that had been put in front of me the morning of the divorce, was not what Greer had described. Its subclauses authorized Derek to deduct any sum he categorized as an outstanding joint obligation from my settlement share before I received it. The debts he had claimed, utility arrears, maintenance fees, accumulated legal costs, were fabricated or substantially inflated. The total deducted $46,953. And the house, I asked, the Crestwood house, that was Linda's, Eddie said. The court gave it to her in the settlement. She sold it herself. Derek had nothing to do with that transaction. He said it plainly without editorial. What Derek did was separate. He did it through the disbursement paper alone. I stood with this for a moment. It clarified something I had been unable to fully resolve: the mechanics of it, the specific shape of what had happened. The house had gone to Linda lawfully. What had been stolen from me was the cash through an instrument I had signed in good faith in my own living room. There's one more thing, Eddie said. About the date the trust was established, the specific date. He paused. Thomas Whitfield should be the one to tell you that part. He asked me to leave it for him. I've kept that promise long enough. I'll let him keep the rest of it. I did not press him on it. Whatever Thomas knew about the date, it would wait until August. We stood on the pier until the light began to leave the water. Eddie eventually picked up his tackle box and his rod. Your father didn't forget this place, he said as he turned to go. He put it exactly where Derek couldn't reach it. He walked back along the pier without looking back. I returned to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long time. The tin box sat on the shelf where it had always sat. The sealed letter inside it, the Thomas Whitfield business card now resting on top of the tin rather than inside it where I had placed it the week before. Arthur had left one instruction. Don't tell James until he finds his own way back. I had found my way back. But the conversation on the pier had shown me what I had not yet fully understood, that there were still layers beneath the surface, and that at least one of them was being held in trust by a man who would return to his office in August. I looked at the business card. Soon, I thought. Soon I would go in person. I had called Thomas Whitfield's office the morning after my conversation with Eddie. His assistant told me he would be fully back in August and would be in touch to arrange a meeting. In the meantime, something arrived from Crestwood that I had not anticipated. The weeks between June and July had moved at the pace of work that has found its rhythm. The stand was running consistently. The notebooks continued. I was into the 17th now, the entries shorter and more compressed than the earlier ones, as if Arthur had been writing faster in his final years, aware of what was left of his time. Rosa had become a reliable presence on Tuesday mornings, occasionally staying long enough to drink her second cup, standing at the counter rather than in her car. The wider community of Harrow Cove had begun to orient itself toward the stand in the way that communities orient toward things that become dependable not with fanfare, but with regularity. The post office slip appeared in the mailbox on the second Tuesday of July, a package held for pickup. No return address. Postmark Crestwood. Rosa was already parked in the gravel turnaround when I came out with the slip. She had finished her night shift 2 hours earlier and had stopped at the stand on her way home, as she had done 4 times in the past 6 weeks. When I told her what the slip was for, she offered to drive before I had finished the sentence. The Harrow Cove post office was a narrow building on the main road through town, its counter attended by a woman named Carol, who had worked there, she told us, when we came in for 22 years. She retrieved the package from the back room with the unhurried efficiency of long practice and set it on the counter. "Package for Calloway," she said. "Sign here." I signed. The package was the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper, sealed with clear tape at every edge, with the thoroughness of someone who wanted to make certain the contents arrived intact. We took it back to the house. This was the first time Rosa had come inside. She followed me through the front door without ceremony, not hesitating, not commenting on the space moving through it, with the easy observational attention of someone accustomed to entering unfamiliar rooms and making immediate assessments of them. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. The 23 notebooks were arranged on the shelf above the counter in their numbered order spines outward, their cloth covers ranging from dark brown to faded green across the row. Rosa looked at them for a long moment before looking at anything else in the room. "Are those what you cook from?" she said. "My father wrote them, all 23. She stepped closer to the shelf and looked at them without touching, then after a moment reached out and ran 2 fingers along the spine of notebook 1. The gesture was careful in the specific way that people handle things they understand to be irreplaceable. She said nothing more about them. She pulled out the kitchen chair and sat down while I opened the package. Inside the brown paper, my winter coat. The dark green wool one I had worn every winter for 9 years, the one I had left hanging behind the bedroom door the morning of the signing, because the pre-packed duffel had not included it, and I had not thought to take it with me. Below the coat folded once a single sheet of notepaper, 4 words in a handwriting I did not immediately identify, and then did. "The weather in Harrow Cove is cold. No name, no return address, nothing else." Rosa leaned forward slightly from where she sat. "What does it say?" I read it to her. She was quiet for a moment. Someone in that house still had a conscience. I folded the note and did not answer. I was looking at the handwriting, the particular slope of it, the way the letters leaned slightly left, the small loop on the lowercase d that I had seen on a grocery list, once pinned to the refrigerator, and again on a birthday card, left on the kitchen counter 2 years ago, which I had read briefly and set down without thinking much about. A handwriting I had seen without ever studying. I was studying it now. I did not say the name aloud. What I thought I kept to myself, which was that the morning I had left the house in Crestwood, there had been one person in that room who had turned away from the signing rather than watching it complete, whose face, when Greer's briefcase clicked shut, had held something that I had read in my exhaustion and my willingness to think well of no one in particular as indifference. Looking at the 4 words on the notepaper, I was no longer confident that indifference had been the right reading. I was not yet certain what the right reading was. But the coat was here, and the note was here, and the handwriting was here, and someone had known that I had left without it. I put the note in the tin box on top of the sealed letter from Arthur. Then I put the coat on. The notebooks, Rosa said, still looking at the shelf. Were they all written by the same person? Same handwriting, same sequence over several decades. I sat down across from her. He started the first one when he was about my age now. What's in them? Recipes. Mostly, but not only. She thought about this. Can I read one sometime? I'll make you a copy of the chowder entry. I'd like that. That evening, I sat with Eddie on his porch and told him about the package. He listened without surprise, which was its own kind of information, the same way his lack of surprise at anything had become over the course of 4 months a data point I was learning to read. Did Arthur ever mention Vanessa? I asked. Eddie held his mug with both hands and considered the question with the care he applied to questions he knew had weight. He said some people wait until the cost is right before they show you who they really are, he said at last. He wasn't talking about anyone specific as far as I knew. Or maybe he was. With your father, it was sometimes hard to tell. He refilled his cup from the thermos. We sat in the dark for a while longer without speaking. I did not sleep well that night. Not because I was worried the anxiety of the early months had flattened into something more workable, a background awareness rather than a foreground fact. I did not sleep well because I was beginning to understand something about the morning I had left Crestwood, something that had been visible in the room and that I had looked directly at and failed to read correctly. I found that the process of understanding it was slower than the understanding itself, and that one could arrive at a conclusion well before one had finished arriving at it. By August, the wooden stand had become something I had not planned for a reason people took the long way through Harrow Cove, which is not a short detour from anywhere. The transition had happened without a discernible moment I could point to. 1 week the stand was an experiment. Several weeks later, it was an institution in the small and local sense that word carries in a coastal town of 4,000 people. Rosa had told her co-workers at the hospital. A woman who came on alternate Saturdays had told her book group. The contractor who stopped on Fridays had apparently mentioned it at a job site in Millbrook because 2 of his colleagues began appearing on alternating Thursdays with the self-conscious air of people who have been told a place is worth the drive and are checking whether they agree. They seemed to agree. Eddie and I had expanded the stand modestly a second soy horse to accommodate a second pot, a folding table for the crab and finnan haddie on Saturdays. The handwritten sign had been replaced with a wooden board that Eddie had painted over the course of a weekend, the lettering improved considerably by his use of a smaller brush. Marcus Webb arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of August. He was a broad man in his early 50s, well-dressed in the practical way of someone who spends most of his time in a working kitchen and has calibrated his clothing accordingly. He introduced himself directly Marcus Webb, owner of Webb's Table, the restaurant, at the far end of Harrow Cove's main road, and placed his business card on the plank counter with the assurance of a man accustomed to being taken seriously. "I've been meaning to come down for 3 weeks," he said. "Every time I plan to, there's a reason not to." "And today?" I asked. Today the reason wasn't sufficient." He looked at the pots with the evaluating eye of a professional. "I'd like to talk about a supply arrangement. I can pay 3 months up front for exclusive rights to your chowder and catch." I had spoken with Eddie the evening before about exactly this kind of conversation. Eddie had listened to my description of what I expected Marcus to propose, and then said without particular emphasis, "Your father never signed exclusivity. He said a recipe that belongs to only one table stops being anyone's food." He meant it practically, not philosophically. "I appreciate the offer," I told Marcus, I won't do exclusivity, but I can supply you on a partial basis on a schedule we agree on at a price that works for both of us. Marcus looked at me for a moment, with the measured expression of a man running the arithmetic. How fair, he said. He picked up the card and put it back in his pocket, which struck me as the gesture of a man who understood the meeting had shifted from a transaction to a negotiation and was prepared for that. Your father sold me my first restaurant supply order. 20 years ago, give or take. Fresh clams, live crab, 2 cases of smoked cod. I drove up here because someone told me he was the best supplier on the coast. A brief pause. I should have expected exactly this conversation. He was specific about the exclusivity. He said it so clearly, I wrote it down. Marcus looked at the second pot. There's probably more about him you don't know yet than you've had time to realize. We settled the terms in 20 minutes, standing at the plank counter while the morning's customers came and went around us. A partial supply arrangement 3 times weekly with pricing indexed to market rate on the catch. No exclusivity. A 30-day notice period on either side. Marcus shook my hand, said he would have his kitchen manager call by the end of the week and left. Rosa arrived at her usual time, slightly after the morning rush had thinned. She had brought her own coffee from somewhere which was new. Who was the man in the jacket? She asked, nodding in the direction Marcus had gone. Restaurant owner. We made a supply deal. Good deal or polite deal? Good deal, I said. He understood the terms. After the stand closed at noon, Rosa suggested lunch at the diner on Main Street, the first time either of us had proposed extending the Tuesday morning into the afternoon. We walked there from the stand, a 7-minute walk along the road, and sat at a window table with sandwiches and the particular ease of people who have moved past the conversational stage that requires constant maintenance. I told her over the course of that lunch why I had come to Harrow Cove. Not all of it. Not the trust fund. Not the specific numbers, not the names or the legal mechanisms. But the shape of it that I had left a house in Crestwood, with very little that the house here had belonged to my father, that I had arrived in March, with no plan beyond a key that still fit a lock. Rosa listened the way she had listened the first time I described Arthur's notebooks without interruption, without the reflexive nodding that signals a person is waiting for their turn to speak, without advice or redirection, or the well-meant but preemptive comfort that most people offer when they hear a story like this. She just listened. When I stopped talking, she finished her coffee and looked out the window for a moment. Is it what you needed? She said finally. I don't know yet, I said. But it's what I have. She seemed to find this acceptable. We walked back to the stand, and she helped me pack up the remaining containers, which she had not done before. I noted it without comment. Some things become true before they are acknowledged. It was Rosa on the walk back who mentioned the 2 men at the counter inside the diner. She had overheard part of their conversation while I was paying something about a coastal property assessment fishing rights, a development survey being conducted along the Harrow Cove shoreline. She mentioned it the way you mention things that seem like background detail, local business, nothing relevant. I registered it the same way. Local noise. It did not stay with me. Thomas Whitfield's office called that afternoon. He was fully back, the assistant said. He could meet in 2 weeks if that worked. I confirmed the appointment and set the phone down. 2 weeks. I had been waiting since March for a conversation that I now understood was more than a formality. I had time. I had the stand, the notebooks, the routine that had grown up around both. 2 weeks was nothing. I did not know yet that before those 2 weeks were out, something would arrive in the post that would transform the meeting from an item on a list into the most urgent appointment I had. September in Harrow Cove does not announce itself. The air simply changes one morning, sharper at the edges, colder along the water, and you understand, without being told, that the easier months are behind you. The supply arrangement with Marcus Webb had been running for 3 weeks. His kitchen manager, a precise and efficient woman named Diane, called every Monday to confirm the week's order, and the transaction had settled into the reliable cadence of 2 parties who had each decided the other was trustworthy. The stand continued. Rosa continued. Eddie continued. The notebooks were nearly finished. I was into the 22nd, the entries, brief and late period, written in a hand that had become slightly less steady without losing any of its precision. The letter arrived on the 2nd Tuesday of September. It was a formal envelope, heavyweight cream stock, the return address printed in the measured font of a firm that wanted you to understand it was serious before you had opened anything. I did not recognize the firm name. The city on the return address was not one I associated with Derek. I opened it at the kitchen table while the morning's first pot came to temperature. The letter was 4 pages. I read all of them before doing anything else. Derek's attorney was not claiming that the Harrow Cove property belonged to Derek. The letter was more sophisticated than that, and considerably more legally grounded. What it argued under the framework of the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act, a body of law governing the transfer of assets when fraud may be involved, was that Arthur had established the irrevocable trust as an act of fraudulent conveyance. In plain terms, the letter claimed Arthur had moved the property into the trust specifically to shield it from future creditors or marital claims, including Linda's potential interest. If this could be demonstrated, a court could order the trust voided and the property treated as part of the original marital estate. The remedy they proposed James could either submit to a court review of the trust's validity, or he could pay Derek $180,000 to settle the claim and avoid litigation. I set the letter down and sat with it for a moment. Then I opened my phone and searched for the Harrow Cove Coastal Development Survey that Rosa had mentioned in passing 3 weeks ago. It took 4 minutes to find the Planning Commission document. The assessed value of the fishing rights along the relevant coastal strip, the strip that included the shoreline in front of the beach house, was listed at an estimated $1.4 million pending formal rights appraisal. $1.4 million. Derek's opening demand was $180,000. The arithmetic of the situation was not complicated. I brought the letter to Eddie. He read it at the kitchen table with the methodical attention of a man who had spent enough time around working documents to understand that the language was the point. When he finished, he set it down and looked at it for another moment without speaking. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think it's a weak claim," he said. "The trust was established 15 years before your marriage had any recorded problems. The law requires them to show Arthur intended to defraud someone at the time he established it. 15 years of clean history makes that very hard to argue. But weak claims still cost real money to defend if you don't have the right person in your corner." He folded his hands on the table. "Call Thomas Whitfield. Today." I called from the kitchen while Eddie waited. Thomas answered directly, his own voice, not an assistant's, which told me he had been expecting something like this, or had been staying close to the phone for reasons of his own. "Mr. Calloway," he said before I had fully introduced myself. "I've received a letter from a law firm, Derek's attorneys. They're making a fraudulent conveyance claim under the UVTA, arguing the trust should be voided." "I'd read it to me," Thomas said. I read all 4 pages. Thomas was silent throughout, with the particular silence of someone who is listening and filing simultaneously. "Come in Thursday," he said when I finished. "Don't respond to anything before then. Don't acknowledge receipt. Don't contact the firm. Don't discuss the letter with Derek or anyone connected to him. Do we have a case?" A pause, not the pause of uncertainty, but of a man choosing how precisely to say something he already knows. "Mr. Calloway, your father built this case 15 years ago. I've been holding it for him. Come Thursday and I'll show you what he built." I set the phone down and stood at the counter for a moment. Then I called Rosa. She answered on the second ring, the voice of someone who had just finished a shift and was in the particular suspended state between exhaustion and sleep. "I need you to drive me somewhere on Thursday," I said. "2 hours north." "I know it's a big ask." "What time?" she said. "Early, 7 maybe. I'll be there at 7. No pause, no qualification. The way a person answers when they have already decided to help before the question is fully formed. I thanked her and set the phone down. Eddie was still at the kitchen table. I returned the letter to its envelope and set it beside the tin box on the shelf, an object beside an object, each one carrying something I had not yet fully resolved. Through the window, the wooden stand was visible at the edge of the gravel turnaround. I had built that stand with 2 sawhorses and a plank. I had built the customer base 1 cup at a time, 1 Tuesday at a time, 1 careful batch of chowder at a time. I had repaired the porch board and sealed the window and leveled the shelf. I had done all of this with $47 and the notebooks of a man who had anticipated 15 years in advance that I would need exactly what he had left. I was not prepared to lose it to the same people by the same methods. That evening I took the tin box from the shelf, removed the sealed letter, held it in both hands. Not yet. But soon, that word carried weight it had not carried before. I could feel the soon becoming specific, like a date approaching on a calendar. I set the letter back. Thursday 1st. 1 thing at a time in the order they required. I had soup to make in the morning, and a drive to make on Thursday, and a man to meet who had been holding something for 15 years. That would be enough to begin with. Before I show you what Thomas Whitfield had been holding for 15 years, before I tell you what my father actually wrote in that file the week I told him about the loan, type Arthur in the comments, because what you're about to hear is the part of this story I still think about every single day. One thing to keep in mind, some details in this story have been shaped for narrative and educational purposes. Names, places, and certain events are not drawn from any specific source, but the lesson this story carries is one I believe is worth your time. If this isn't for you, it's completely fine to choose something else. But if you're still here, let's continue. Rosa drove. 2 hours north on a coast road I had never taken to meet a man I had never spoken to in person, about a document my father had signed 15 years ago and never mentioned once. She drove the way she did most things competently and without ceremony, the radio off, the conversation present when there was something worth saying and absent when there was not. I had the manila folder with the lawyer's letter on my lap, though I had read it enough times by now to have most of it memorized. I watched the coast move past the passenger window and let the drive be what it was. Thomas Whitfield's office was on the 3rd floor of a converted harborside building in a town called Port Wren, 2 hours and 7 minutes north of Harrow Cove. It was a quiet office, 1 assistant at a desk in the anteroom, shelves of bound documents along the walls, the particular order of a space maintained by a person who finds disorder genuinely difficult to work in. Thomas himself met us at the door. He was in his early 50s, lean and precise in his movements, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a handshake that was brief and firm. Rosa said she would wait downstairs. Thomas and I sat. The files were already on his desk. "I want to start with their claim," he said without preamble, "so you understand what you're dealing with before we get to the rest." He explained the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act argument, what Derek's attorneys were attempting, and why it was weaker than it appeared on paper. The UVTA allows a court to void a transfer of assets if the transfer was made with intent to defraud a creditor or future claimant. Derek's attorneys were arguing that Arthur had established the trust, anticipating that a divorce would eventually occur, and had moved the property specifically to protect it from Linda's potential marital claim. The problem with that argument, Thomas said, is the date. The trust was established in September of 2009. Your marriage had no documented difficulties in 2009. There were no separation filings, no counseling records, no correspondence indicating marital trouble. For the UVTA claim to succeed, they need to show Arthur intended to defraud someone at the moment he created the trust. 15 years of a clean, intact marriage before the divorce makes that nearly impossible to establish. But they filed anyway, I said, because filing is free and defending is expensive. The claim is leverage. Their client needed a number, and this was the number they could construct. He folded his hands on the desk. We will win this. I want you to understand that before anything else. I understood it. There's also something else, Thomas said. He opened a second file thinner than the first, but handled with more care. Howard Greer's appearance in the asset transfer process constitutes a conflict of interest under Bar Association ethics rules. A lawyer cannot meaningfully represent both parties in a financial transaction where one party's interests are adverse to the other's. That conflict gives you grounds to challenge the disbursement authorization itself as a product of fraudulent misrepresentation, separate from the divorce settlement the court approved. Meaning I could recover the $46,000. Meaning you have a very strong basis to pursue it. Yes. He reached into the first file and removed a single document, a photocopy of a court filing form, the kind generated when a trust is registered with the county. He placed it in front of me and pointed to a date in the upper right corner, September 7th, 2009. Does that date mean anything to you? He asked. I looked at it for a moment. September 2009. The year Derek had borrowed $85,000 from me and not returned it. The year I had told my father in the kitchen of my father's house in Harrow Cove on a Saturday morning in late summer what had happened. Yes, I said. Thomas turned to the last page of the file. In the bottom margin of the original trust instrument in the cramped, precise handwriting that I had now spent 8 months reading across 23 notebooks, there was a notation. 4 lines, written in blue ink, that had faded slightly at the edges but remained entirely legible. Established following conversation with James Reed Derrick Loan. Jay does not know. Keep it that way until he needs to know. I did not speak for a long time. The room was quiet. Thomas did not fill the silence. He had clearly decided some time ago that this moment would require whatever space it needed. He wrote that himself, I said finally. It was not a question. In his own hand the day the filing was completed. I was present when he wrote it. I looked at the 4 lines again. My father, at 68 or 69, roughly the age I was now sitting in this or some earlier version of this office, writing a note that was not for Thomas and not for any legal record, but for the specific future in which I would be sitting in this chair reading it. Jay does not know. Keep it that way until he needs to know. Thomas opened a third folder and set it between us. 6 weeks ago, I received a package, he said. Anonymous sender. Inside were copies of the disbursement authorization with the fabricated debt items highlighted and annotated, and a note. He slid the note across the desk. 4 words on a card. He deserves to know the truth. I looked at the handwriting, the leftward slope of it, the small loop on the lowercase d, the same handwriting as the note in the coat package. I said nothing. Thomas did not ask. The envelope referenced Arthur Calloway's estate paperwork, Thomas said. Whoever sent it had found my name in those files. I understood. When Arthur died in 2021, Derek had managed the estate process, had gathered the files, handled the paperwork, kept the records in his home office. Vanessa had lived in that house. Vanessa had access to those records. Vanessa had found a name on a document from 2009 and had held that name for more than 2 years before she used it. The documents she sent, I said. Are they usable? When entirely, she obtained them in her own home. There's no question of admissibility. Thomas closed the folders. Your father built this protection in the same week you told him about the loan, he said. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you carrying the knowledge of it, and because he understood that if Derek ever suspected the door was already closed, he would simply find another door. Your father needed Derek to believe the property was reachable right up until the moment it wasn't. I sat with that for a moment. Then I stood, shook Thomas's hand, and walked back downstairs to where Rosa was waiting with 2 cups of coffee she had found somewhere in the building. On the drive home, I held the folder on my lap and said nothing for nearly an hour. Rosa did not ask. She drove the coast road south the way she had driven it north steadily without pressing. When we reached the Harrow Cove turnoff, I spoke. My father was smarter than all of us. Rosa kept her eyes on the road. Most good fathers are, she said quietly. I looked out the window at the coastline going dark, the water turning from gray to black at the horizon. I thought about the sealed letter in the tin box, still unopened, still waiting. I understood now that I was close. Not there yet, but close. I knew finally approximately how much time remained between where I was and where I needed to be. That was more than I had known this morning. It would be enough to get me there. 3 weeks after the meeting with Thomas Whitfield, Derek's legal claim had been formally dismissed. I told only Eddie and Rosa. Some victories do not need witnesses. November came in the way November comes to a coastal town gradually and then all at once. The stand had moved indoors to the kitchen window by the end of October, a concession to the weather that Marcus Webb had helped facilitate by arranging for a small serving hatch to be cut through the lower section of the window frame. It was less elegant than the plank and sawhorses setup, but it was functional, and the regulars adapted without complaint. Rosa began stopping on Monday evenings as well as Tuesday mornings. Eddie had taken to eating dinner in the kitchen 2 or 3 times a week, reading from one of his own books, while I cooked, the 2 of us occupying the space in the companionable way of people who have learned each other's rhythms. Thomas Whitfield had sent a formal letter confirming the dismissal of Derek's claim and outlining the process for challenging the disbursement authorization. That challenge was in progress. I had not told anyone in Crestwood about any of it. There was no one in Crestwood left to tell as far as I was concerned. I was finishing the late afternoon inventory, counting containers, noting what needed to be restocked before Wednesday when the phone rang. The number on the screen was one I recognized immediately from 43 years of recognizing it in the way you recognize a phone number that has been part of the texture of your daily life long enough to become involuntary. Linda. I answered on the 3rd ring. I almost didn't call, she said. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed an opening and then decided against it, and is now improvising. But you did, I said. A pause. Yes. Another pause, shorter. How are you? Better than I was in March, I said, which is not a high bar, but it's an honest answer. She was quiet for a moment. I waited. I hired an accountant, she said. An independent one. In July. Another pause, the kind that comes when a person is choosing how precisely to say something painful. In June, a friend of mine, she works in financial planning. She asked me some questions about the house sale. The numbers I described to her. She said the figure I received seemed low relative to what the sale price should have generated, even accounting for fees and taxes. A breath. She was right. How much? High, more than $90,000. That's what the accountant determined. The distribution I received was more than $90,000 short of what I was legally entitled to from the sale. I set down the pen I had been holding. When did you know for certain? September. The accountant confirmed it in September. She stopped. I spent October deciding whether to call you. What decided it? A long pause. Long enough that I almost said something to fill it. Then, I didn't know James. I want you to understand that. I signed what they put in front of me. Derek told me the distribution was correct. He gave me documents that showed the accounting. I didn't question it because I didn't think. She stopped again. I trusted him, the same way you trusted him. I thought about that for a moment. About the morning in the living room. The two sets of documents. The way Derek had said just paperwork, Dad, with the particular patience of a man who had practiced the delivery. About the fact that Linda and I had both sat in that room and had both in our different ways signed what was placed in front of us without fully understanding what we were signing. I don't know for certain what you knew or didn't know, I said. I want to be honest with you about that. But I choose to believe you didn't know because the alternative is something I'm not prepared to carry alongside everything else. And because the way you looked that morning told me you weren't in that room by choice. A long silence. I looked away, she said. When you were signing. I looked away because I couldn't watch it, and I didn't know how to stop it. And I had been told over and over for 2 years that it was the right thing, that you would be fine, that it was better for both of us, that the money was enough. Her voice had gone quieter. I didn't know Derek had taken more. I thought the number was the number. I believe you, I said. It was simpler than what I had told her before, and more accurate. I believed her not because I needed to, or because it was easier, but because the specific texture of what she was describing matched what I understood now about how the 2 years before March had been constructed. Derek had operated in the space between two people who trusted him. That space had been very large because we had made it large, and he had used every part of it. I'm sorry, Linda said. It came out as a single exhaled word stripped of whatever formality she had intended to give it. I know, I said. I know you are. Is that enough? I looked out the kitchen window at the November water, gray-green, close-peaked waves, the light already going at 4 in the afternoon. 43 years of mornings. A painting of the Maine coastline she had chosen because it reminded her of somewhere she had always wanted to go, that I had always meant to take her, that I had left behind in a house that was no longer mine. Tonight it is, I said. We did not speak for long after that. There was nothing to arrange, nothing to plan, no reason to extend the conversation into territory that neither of us was ready to enter. She did not ask to see the house. I did not offer it. Some things close without ceremony, and some things that have closed may eventually become something different, but they take their time about it and cannot be rushed any more than a chowder base can be rushed. After I set the phone down, I sat at the table for a long while without moving. Then I opened the personal notebook, the one I had started in the back of Arthur's notebook one, and wrote a single line. She called. Nothing beneath it. I closed the notebook and looked at the tin box on the shelf. The sealed letter inside it, the wax thumbprint still intact. Almost, I thought. The word felt different from not yet. Almost has a direction. Almost is moving towards something specific rather than simply waiting. I could feel the difference between them the way you feel the difference between still water and water beginning to move. She called first, which I appreciated. Some people arrive at your door with the expectation of being received. Vanessa had never been that kind of person, something I had misread badly for a very long time. She called on a Wednesday evening in the first week of December. She said she had been thinking about calling since October and had found a reason not to each week until she ran out of reasons. She asked if she could come. I said yes. She said she would take the bus and didn't want me to meet her at the station. I met her at the station anyway. She looked different from the last time I had seen her, which was the morning in the living room when she had been standing at the kitchen doorway. Thinner, more deliberate in her movements, with the particular self-possession of someone who has been through something difficult and has not yet decided whether they are finished being difficult. She was carrying a small bag and wearing a coat I didn't recognize. Everything she owned from before was presumably elsewhere. We walked to the cafe on Main Street, the one Rosa and I had discovered together in August, 3 tables by the window coffee that was better than the decor suggested. We sat across from each other and ordered, and then Vanessa set her hands flat on the table and began. She had first understood what was happening in September of 2022. Howard Greer had come to the house that week to go over the initial documents with Derek, and she had read the power of attorney language while Derek was in the kitchen making coffee. She had read it carefully twice and had understood within the first reading what it was designed to permit. "Why didn't you say anything then?" I asked. She looked at the table for a moment. "Because I thought I could change it, and because I was afraid of what would happen if I tried." She looked up. "Those are 2 different things, but they felt like the same thing at the time." She had spent the following 18 months from that September through the March, when I left photographing every document that passed through the Home Office. Quietly over 4 separate periods when Derek was out and the papers were accessible. She had not known what she would do with them. She had known only that if the situation became what she suspected it was, becoming someone would need a record of what had been agreed and when. After I left, she held the copies for 6 months, watching, waiting for Derek to make his next move. When the legal claim against the Harrow Cove property arrived, she understood that the next move had arrived. "I found Thomas Whitfield's name in your father's estate files," she said. "Derek had them in the Home Office. He handled the paperwork when Arthur died. The name was on a document from 2009. I didn't know what it meant, but it was the only name I had." You sent everything anonymously." "Sorry, I didn't want Derek to know until after it had reached someone who could use it. I sent the coat separately a few weeks earlier. I didn't know if you'd know who it was from." "I knew," I said. "Derek had found out 3 weeks after the package went out." She did not describe the weeks that followed in detail, and I did not ask. What she said was that the divorce had been finalized in October, that she had lost the majority of what she had brought into the marriage plus a portion of what she had earned during it, and that she had been aware this was the likely outcome before she sent anything. "I had already decided that was the price," she said, "before I sent the first envelope. I thought about what that meant to make a decision with that specific knowledge attached to it, to send those documents anyway, knowing the return address was your own life. You did the right thing at the hardest possible moment," I said. "That counts for more than a lifetime of not doing anything wrong." She looked at me steadily. "You don't have to say that. I know. I'm saying it because it's true." We left the cafe and walked along the shore road toward the house. The December light was low and clean, the water a deep gray green under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to produce weather. Vanessa asked about the restaurant. I told her about the stand, the notebooks Marcus and Rosa, and the supply arrangement, the way the beach house had changed over 9 months. She listened with the focused attention of someone who needed to hear that something good had emerged from the wreckage. I tried to tell it accurately. At the turnout where the wooden stand had spent the summer, she stopped and looked at the house for a moment. "He would have run the kitchen himself," she said, "if he'd lived to see it. Arthur, he would have told you everything you were doing wrong, and then he would have been proud." We stood there for a moment, the 2 of us looking at the house from the road. "I should have acted sooner," she said. "You acted when you could," I said. "That's all anyone ever manages." I meant it. It was the truest thing I knew how to say about most of the people I had encountered over the past 9 months. The ones who had acted when they could, which was rarely at the first available moment, and almost always later than either they or I would have liked. Her car, borrowed, she said, from a friend in Port Wren, came to collect her at 3. I watched it pull out of the gravel turnaround and move up the coastal road until it disappeared at the bend. Eddie came out of his cottage. "Who was that?" he said. I looked at where the car had been. Someone who chose right when it would have been much easier not to. He considered this in his particular way, taking it seriously, without making a production of taking it seriously. Arthur would have liked her, he said. He went back inside before I could respond. I stood in the December cold, hands in my coat pockets, and thought about my father, about the quality of foresight he had demonstrated again and again in matters I had not understood until long after the fact. I was beginning to think there was very little in the end that had surprised him. The sign went up on a Tuesday morning in February, while the tide was out, and the light came low and gold over the water the way it does in Harrow Cove. In winter, a particular kind of light that seems to originate from the water itself rather than arriving at it. The 2 months between December and February had been occupied with construction. In the specific sense, Marcus Webb's contractor had cut the serving hatch wider and closed the porch against the weather with sliding glass panels that could be removed in summer, and built proper counter-seating along the south wall. The kitchen had been reorganized around the cast iron pots as its functional center. The 23 notebooks were arranged on the shelf above the pass-through window spines outward in numbered order visible from the dining area. Eddie had painted the sign himself over 3 evenings in January on a piece of salvaged cedar plank, Captain Arthur's Seafood. The lettering was steady and clean. He had used a small brush this time. Rosa was first through the door at 9 in the morning, which I had expected. Marcus arrived at 9:15 with 2 of his kitchen staff, who looked around the dining room with the evaluating attention of people in the trade. The contractor who had stopped at the stand on Fridays came at 9:30 with his wife, which I had not expected. By 10 o'clock, the nurse who drove from 3 towns over was at the counter with her coat still on, ordering before she had fully sat down. I worked the kitchen alone. The chowder had been started the previous evening. The base built slowly, the way the notebooks described it, the way Eddie had taught me to recognize by sound and smell before the color changed. By 9:30, it was ready. I did not rush it. "How many out front?" I called through the pass-through. "Out of 8, seated 4, waiting on the porch." Rosa called back. She had appointed herself to the front without being asked, which was characteristic of her. "Tell the 4 it'll be worth it." I already did. They already know. By noon, the line extended past the porch and along the gravel turnaround. Marcus's staff had returned after their own lunch service to help with the tables. Eddie managed the door with the calm authority of a man who has been deciding who comes in from the cold for 71 years. Mid-afternoon, in a brief window between orders, Eddie appeared at the kitchen pass-through. Marcus heard from his accountant, he said quietly. Derek filed for bankruptcy in January. I looked at him for a moment, nodded once, turned back to the stove. That was sufficient. Around 3 o'clock, the pace slowed enough for Eddie to come into the kitchen with his coffee and stand near the window. Rosa followed still in the improvised apron she had put on at 9. Marcus leaned in the doorway. Eddie raised his cup. "To Arthur," he said. "Who knew before we did?" The kitchen went quiet. Through the pass-through, the dining room went quiet with it, or so it seemed. The sound stopped in the particular way that happens when a room of people, without coordinating, all decide to listen at the same moment. Then, from somewhere near the back, someone began to clap. It moved through the room. I stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at the full dining room, the people at the counter, the tables, the glass-paneled porch, the 23 notebooks on the shelf above the pass-through, the cedar sign, visible through the front window, catching the last of the afternoon light. I thought about the ATM screen in March, the $0, the $47 in an envelope pressed into my hand at my own front door. I thought about a cold platform at 1:40 in the morning and a 2-mile walk in the dark. I did not feel triumph. What I felt was quieter than that and more permanent. The particular settledness of a person who has arrived somewhere after a long time of not being sure they would. The last customer left at 5:30. I washed the remaining bowls alone in the kitchen, the dining room quiet behind me. Outside, the tide had come back in. The light was gone from the water. On the shelf above the pass-through, 23 notebooks in their numbered order. The tin box beside them. And beside the tin box, resting where I had placed it that morning, the sealed envelope. Arthur's thumbprint still in the wax. Still closed. I dried my hands on the dish towel and looked at it. Not yet had long since become soon. And soon I understood now, standing in the kitchen of a restaurant that had not existed 11 months ago, had finally become almost tonight. He came on a Wednesday, which is the quietest day of the week at Captain Arthur's. I don't know if he chose that deliberately. I have decided it doesn't matter. By April, the restaurant had settled into the rhythms of an established place, not famous, not written about anywhere beyond a paragraph in the county's tourism newsletter, but known in the specific and durable way that things become known in a coastal town when they are consistently good. Wednesday brought in perhaps a third of the weekend numbers, the retired couple from Millbrook, a few regulars from the harbor, whoever happened to be passing through on the midweek lull. It was the day I used to restock and repair, to read through the notebooks, in the hour before opening, to eat my own bowl of chowder, standing at the kitchen counter, without having to do anything else at the same time. I had finished the last notebook, the 23rd, 2 weeks earlier. The final entry was a short one written in a compressed hand on the last page. If the kitchen is still going when someone reads this, it was worth the trouble. I had read it 3 times, and then closed the book and placed it back on the shelf in its numbered order. He came in just before noon. I recognized his walk before I recognized his face, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he moved through a doorway. I was at the pass-through window when he entered, and I saw him from behind, first a man slightly smaller than I remembered, as if the months between March and now had compressed something in him. He was thinner. The jacket was one I didn't recognize, a plain navy thing, not the tailored wool he had worn for years. When he turned to look at the room, I saw that the expensive watch was gone. He stood at the entrance and looked around slowly. The 23 notebooks on the shelf above the pass-through. The photographs of the coastline that Rosa had helped me hang in November. The glass-paneled porch with its 4 occupied tables. The handwritten specials board. The cedar sign above the counter, the lettering in Eddie's careful hand. He looked at all of it with an expression I could not name. Not contempt. Not envy. Something more difficult to categorize. The look of a person examining a thing they had not previously understood was possible. Eddie was at the door. He saw Derek first turn to find me at the pass-through and looked at me with a question that was not a question. I gave him one nod. He took a step back and made himself unobtrusive in the way only someone of long practice can. Derek sat at the corner table. I came out of the kitchen. I had not planned what I would say. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. We looked at each other across the table, the width of an ordinary restaurant table, which is not very wide at all, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. I had thought at various points over the past 13 months about what this moment might look like if it came. I had imagined several versions of it, most of them involving more words than what actually occurred. What I had not imagined was the quality of the silence, which was not hostile and not comfortable, and was finally just 2 people in a room together with a great deal of history between them that had nowhere particular to go. "What do you need, Derek?" I said. He had no answer ready. That was visible, the slight pause before the usual mechanism, engaged the way a person looks when a question lands differently than they expected a question to land. He had come prepared for accusation, perhaps, or for coldness. A question, a genuine question without edge, was something else. After a moment, "I heard about this place," he said. "I wanted to come and see it." "Now you have?" He looked at the notebooks on the shelf. "Are those Grandpa Arthur's?" "Yes." He was quiet again. I waited. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way someone says something they have rehearsed not to say, but have said anyway, not easily, but without the artifice of performance. Just the words offered across the table with nothing attached to them except what they were. "I know," I said. He waited for more. I gave him nothing more. Not because I was withholding it, but because there was nothing more that was mine to give at this particular moment. The accounting was complete. Thomas Whitfield had handled its legal dimension. The rest of it, the weight of what Derek had done, and why, and what it had cost both of us, was something he would have to carry in whatever way a person carries such things. I had carried my share of it for 13 months, and had found along the way that carrying it differently was possible. I stood up and went back to the kitchen. I ladled out a bowl of chowder. The Wednesday batch started at 7 that morning, built on the base Arthur had described in Notebook 1, and carried it out to the corner table. I set it in front of Derek and sat back down. He looked at it. "Eat," I said, not unkindly. He picked up the spoon. We sat in silence for several minutes while he ate. I did not eat. I had finished my own bowl before opening. I sat with my hands on the table and watched the afternoon light move across the glass panels of the porch, and thought about very little. When Derek had finished, he set the spoon down and looked at the bowl for a moment. Then he stood. I walked him to the door. He stopped on the threshold with the April wind coming in off the water, and looked back at the restaurant once, at the notebooks, at the tables, at the photographs, at the cedar sign. "I didn't think you'd end up somewhere like this," he said. "Neither did I said. "But here is where the key fit." He looked at me for a moment, a look I did not try to interpret, and then walked to the car parked alone in the gravel turnaround. An older model than what I remembered. He got in, backed out, and drove north up the coastal road. I stood in the doorway and watched the car until it disappeared at the bend. The parking lot was empty except for the sound of the water and the wind through the pines that ran along the ridge above the road. I felt no anger. I felt no particular satisfaction. What I felt was the particular stillness of a man who has stood in a doorway and watched someone walk away and understood for the first time that he no longer needed anything from the person leaving. I went back inside. Notebook 1 was open on the counter to page 1. I must have left it there before opening. I closed it carefully without reading the first entry again. I placed it back in its position on the shelf first in the numbered row. Then I went back to the kitchen. The afternoon orders were waiting. Some things I understood now do not need a final word. They only need to be finished. It was the last evening of May when I finally understood that I was ready, not because everything had been resolved, but because I had stopped needing it to be. The restaurant had been closed for 2 hours. The last customer had left at 7:30, a Thursday evening regular who always ordered the Finnan Hattie and always ate slowly and always said leaving that he would see me next week. He would. I had washed the bowls, cleaned the counter, restocked what needed restocking for the morning. I had done these things in the particular order I always did them, in the quiet that comes to a kitchen after the work is done. I sat down at the kitchen table. The room was the way I had come to know it best. The low light above the counter, the pass-through window, dark on the dining side, the smell of the day's cooking still present in the air. On the shelf above the pass-through, the 23 notebooks in their numbered row. And beside them, where it had been for the better part of 15 months, the tin box. I stood up and took the box from the shelf. I set it on the table and opened the lid. Inside the small envelope from the lid's interior, empty now, Thomas Whitfield's business card long since in my coat pocket, its work completed. The note from the package in December folded once tucked against the side, and beneath everything the sealed envelope cream-colored worn at the corners from a year and 3 months of being handled and set back down and handled again. James, open when you're ready. I picked it up. I turned it over once. The wax seal on the back, my father's thumbprint pressed flat into it, the swirl of the ridges still clearly visible. I understood sitting there on the last evening of May that I had been ready for some time. The readiness had arrived quietly, the way most important things arrive, not as a revelation, but as a recognition, the moment you understand that a thing you were waiting for has already begun. I broke the seal, 3 pages folded together. Arthur's handwriting, the same slant I had been reading for 15 months across 23 notebooks, the same deliberate spacing, the same blue ink that faded slightly at the edges. He had written it some time before he died. I could not tell from the handwriting when exactly. He had written it as though he knew with some precision what the letter would need to contain. He wrote, "If you are reading this, you found your own way back to the house. That was the only part I could not do for you, and I am glad you managed it." I read that line 3 times before I went on. The house was never the gift. I want to be clear about that, in case you have been thinking of it that way. The house is wood and salt air and a roof that will need attention in another 5 years. The gift was the time to remember what you already knew and to put it back in the right order. I could not give you that time directly. I could only hold the place where you would have it. I set the pages down for a moment and looked at the window. Outside the May dark and the sound of the tide going out. The notebooks are not mine anymore. A recipe that isn't shared stops being a recipe and becomes only a record. If the kitchen is still going, add to them. Write in them the things I didn't know and the things I got wrong and the things you figured out that I never did. That is how this kind of thing continues. I picked up the pages again. I am sorry I did not say more when I could. I thought there would be more time. There is always looking back more that could have been said during the time that was available. I think about the Saturday mornings when you were young and we would sit in this kitchen before anyone else was awake. I did not say then what I should have said. A man carries that. I set the letter down. The kitchen was entirely quiet. No wind off the water tonight. No movement in the pines along the ridge. The clock on the wall, the one I had found in the back of the second bedroom and had hung above the door in November, marked a minute passing. I hope you are carrying lighter things by now. That is what I wished for you when I wrote this, not knowing when you would read it or what you would have been through before you did. I hope the house held. I hope you found people worth feeding. I hope the chowder base is giving you as much trouble as it gave me, because that trouble is the point of it. I love you. I should have said that more plainly, more often, in more ordinary moments. I am saying it now, which is late, but which is what I have. I read the last paragraph twice. Then I folded the letter carefully, the 3 pages back into their original fold, the fold back into the envelope, and set it on the table beside the tin box. I sat with it for a while, without moving, in the way you sit with something that has been delivered to you across a distance so large that the ordinary measures of distance don't quite apply to it. After a time I stood up. I took notebook 1 from the shelf. I turned to the back to the pages where I had been keeping my own records for the past year, the sales figures and the batch notes, and the one line she called, and below it nothing else. Past all of those to the last blank page. I sat down at the table and picked up a pen. I wrote the date in the upper right corner, May 31st, 2025. Then I began. Not a record, not a note. A recipe, the first one that was entirely mine, built from what the notebooks had taught me, and what the year had added, and what I understood sitting in that kitchen at the end of May that my father had never quite managed to articulate, because it had not yet happened to him when he wrote his. I wrote the way Arthur had cooked, without rushing, without an audience. Not because anyone would read it tonight or tomorrow, but because the act of setting it down carefully was itself the point. The same point the kitchen had been making in one form or another since the first Tuesday morning in May of the previous year, when a woman in hospital scrubs had pulled over on the coast road and asked where I had learned to make soup like this. The pen moved steadily across the page. Outside, the tide was going out. The kitchen light was the only one burning along the shore road. In the dining room, the 22 remaining notebooks stood in their numbered order on the shelf, and the space where notebook 1 had been was empty, and the space would remain empty until morning when I would return it to its place. The page filled. I turned to the next one. There is no ending here. Only this, a kitchen, a light, a pen, moving a page being covered in words that will mean something to whoever comes next. The notebook had a new page. The work was continuing. That was enough. That had always been enough. Among all the grandpa stories I carry, this one changed me the most. Not because of what was taken from me, but because of what was waiting when I finally stopped running from the wrong things. I believe God doesn't always rescue us the way we expect. Sometimes He leaves a key in a coat pocket, a name on a business card, a house that stays ready. My father understood that better than I ever did. This family story is one I'm not proud of in every chapter. So let me say it plainly, don't be like me. Don't sign documents you haven't read just because you're exhausted. Don't confuse family loyalty with blind trust. Protecting yourself is not suspicion, it is self-respect. I learned that at 68, which is far too late. My personal view. Of all the grandpa stories passed down through kitchens and worn notebooks, the most powerful ones aren't about money or houses. They're about foresight, the quiet kind, the kind that works even when the person who arranged it is no longer alive to see it work. This particular family story, ends not with justice but with a pen moving across a blank page. And I think that's exactly right. If something here stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Drop a comment, tell me which moment hit closest to home. And if this channel has earned a place in your week, the subscribe button is right there. Thank you for staying until the very last word. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and inspiration. If that's not your kind of content, no hard feelings, there's something better out there for you. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.